You crawl into a hole.
Okay, thank you.
And you just go away forever. And I hope you'll never get your daughter again.
At 8:59 p.m., a Google search was typed. What to do when toddlers have seizures. At 9:48 p.m., the call to 911 was finally made. 49 minutes passed in silence, while a 3-year-old girl lay unconscious. 49 minutes when decisions, excuses, and hesitation became the difference between life and death. This is the story of Arabella Parker, a child whose short life was marked by joy, imagination, and love, but also by the failures of those who should have protected her. It is a story of missed chances, ignored warnings, and a system that moved too slowly until it was far too late. It is also a story about time, how a few minutes lost can alter everything. Before we go further, I need to offer a content warning. This video discusses child abuse, medical trauma, and systemic negligence. It is not easy to hear, but it is important. Because only by facing these truths can we learn how to protect children better in the future. Arabella's case isn't just another tragedy. It's a window into the cracks of child protection, family courts, and human choice. A grandmother who arrived 27 minutes late to court lost her chance to gain custody. A social worker who skipped a proper exam walked away believing everything was fine. And in those fateful 49 minutes before 911 was called, a little girl's chance at survival slipped away. Each moment reminds us how small decisions can carry enormous consequences. And friends, before we dive into this painful but vital story, I need to ask for your help. Every like, every subscription, every share of this video is a chance for another child to have a happy life. And if you have YouTube's new hype button available, please use it. It's crucial support for my channel and helps amplify stories that truly matter. Share this story everywhere you can and leave your city and viewing time in the comments. It's important for me to know where people are ready to protect children. This is about more than one tragedy. This is about how we can do better. Arabella's story begins, like all children's stories should, with love, family, and the promise of a bright future.
Arabella Margaret Parker came into the world on September 20th, 2016, in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. She was born to 19-year-old Samantha Delcamp and 39-year-old Carl Parker, a couple whose whirlwind romance had started just a year earlier. Their love story moved at lightning speed. Samantha, young and impressionable, was swept off her feet by Carl, a man nearly twice her age who seemed to offer stability, experience, and protection. Within a month of meeting, the two were engaged. Not long after, Samantha was expecting Arabella. For all their flaws, both parents wanted this child, and Arabella's arrival was greeted with joy. From her first days, Arabella stood out. She had a shock of bright red hair that caught the light like fire, and vivid eyes that seemed to search the world with unusual curiosity. People often said she looked like a doll, with her soft, chubby cheeks and that unmistakable baby glow. Family photos from those early months show a content little girl nestled in her mother's arms, or resting peacefully against Carl's shoulder, completely unaware of the turbulence that would later consume her life. For the first couple of years, there were good times. The family managed trips together, moments that felt almost ordinary in their happiness. In the summer of 2017, they traveled to the coast. Photographs from that trip still circulate among family members. Arabella, in a tiny swimsuit, carried in her parents' arms, with endless stretches of sand and sea behind her. She was too little to understand the destination, but in those pictures, her smile is as wide as the ocean itself. A year later, they returned for another vacation. This time, Arabella could toddle around, running clumsily across the beach, laughing as waves washed over her small feet. Her parents watched nearby as she bent down to scoop up seashells, her joy untainted by the troubles simmering beneath the surface of the family. As Arabella grew into a toddler, her personality began to shine. She had a laugh that could light up a room, the kind of deep, contagious giggle that made everyone around her smile. She loved to dance, swaying her whole body to music with abandon. Two songs in particular became her favorites, Jesus Loves Me and Jesus Loves the Little Children. Whenever family sang them, her face would beam with a happiness too pure to ignore. Her relatives would often remark that when Arabella danced or sang, she seemed to glow, as though joy itself was pouring out of her. Arabella also had a sweet tooth, and nothing made her eyes sparkle like the promise of ice cream. Her grandmother, Bonnie, quickly learned that if she wanted to see her granddaughter light up, all it took was a scoop of vanilla or a swirl of chocolate. Sweet Pea, Bonnie called her, a nickname that stuck. It fit Arabella perfectly, soft and tender, but full of life. To Arabella, her grandmother wasn't just Bonnie. She was Mimi, a safe and constant presence in a world that was beginning to grow unpredictable. Mimi and Sweet Pea were inseparable whenever they were together. Arabella would run into her grandmother's arms, wrapping her tiny hands around her neck with fierce love. She had that rare ability to make every relative feel special, handing out hugs and kisses like gifts. But with Mimi, the bond was different. The nickname wasn't just an endearment, it was a promise of protection, though, as time went on, even Mimi's love wouldn't be enough to shield Arabella from what was coming. Like many children, Arabella had comfort objects that she clung to as symbols of safety. Her favorite was a white blanket covered in pink polka dots. She carried it everywhere, dragging it along the floor at family gatherings, curling up with it in the back seat of the car, or holding it tight as she drifted to sleep. That blanket became part of her identity, a constant companion in the middle of a childhood that would soon turn unstable. Arabella's imagination was one of her defining traits. Ordinary objects transformed under her gaze. A shopping cart wasn't just for groceries, it was a royal carriage where she was queen, or a time machine capable of taking her back to meet dinosaurs. Her family marveled at the worlds she invented, watching her chatter to imaginary friends and spin stories far beyond what most 3-year-olds could dream up. She turned the mundane into magic, and for those early years, that magic defined her life. She wasn't just imaginative, she was affectionate. Arabella was the child who'd race across a room to throw her arms around a relative's legs. She greeted cousins, aunts, and uncles with kisses, hugging them as though she hadn't seen them in years, even if it had only been a day. She embodied innocence, freely giving love without condition. By every measure, Arabella was a little girl filled with joy, creativity, and affection. But while her world seemed bright, shadows had already begun to creep in. Beneath the smiles in those family photos and the carefree vacations, cracks were forming in the foundation of her young life. Her parents' relationship was unraveling, and Samantha's choices were becoming increasingly unstable. Arabella's magical world was about to collide with harsh reality. By late 2018, the cracks in Arabella's world began to widen into dangerous gaps. What had once seemed like a whirlwind love story between her parents was over. Samantha and Carl's relationship collapsed, leaving Samantha on her own with a 2-year-old child and nowhere stable to turn. For many young mothers, this would be the moment to lean on family or search for a safe foundation. Instead, Samantha's choices set Arabella on a path that would prove catastrophic. When Carl returned to prison for parole violations, Samantha needed somewhere to live. The decision she made stunned the family. She moved herself and little Arabella into the home of Harry Young, a 76-year-old man with a deeply troubling background involving children. It wasn't just a questionable living arrangement, it was a situation that anyone with common sense would have called alarming. For 7 months, from October 2018 through May 2019, Arabella's world was defined by the walls of Harry Young's home. Arabella's teenage half-sister, Amanda Parker, was one of the first to raise alarms. Amanda had always been protective of her little sister. She'd worried before, but when she learned where Arabella was now living, she couldn't stay silent. She immediately contacted Child Protective Services, filing a report and outlining her concerns in detail. But when Amanda later testified in court, her words cut deep. Nobody wanted to listen to me. Her calls were dismissed, her reports filed away, and her voice drowned in a system that too often favors procedure over instinct. Amanda's attempts were desperate. Phone calls, follow-ups, reaching out in every way she knew how. But each time, her concerns were minimized. Arabella remained in Harry Young's home, her vulnerability dismissed as though it were a minor inconvenience. This was the first of many missed chances. The moment when intervention could have changed everything. If Child Protective Services had listened to Amanda, if someone had investigated Harry Young properly, Arabella might have been spared from what came next. Instead, those 7 months passed like a warning ignored, the danger swept aside until it was too late. During this period, Samantha herself was unraveling. She struggled financially, emotionally, and mentally. Family members noticed a troubling pattern. She seemed to latch onto whoever could provide her with money or stability, no matter their background or their intentions. The well-being of her daughter, the bright, laughing child who loved to dance and sing, was consistently placed second. By June 2019, just a month after Arabella finally left Harry Young's house, Samantha's instability showed itself again. She met 18-year-old Jared Burgess online. He was only a year older than Amanda, yet Samantha, now in her early 20s, quickly became entangled with him. Their relationship escalated in record time, and within weeks, Samantha had moved herself and Arabella into Jared's world. At first, it was a cramped apartment shared with 4 of Jared's male roommates. The environment was chaotic, unsuitable for any child, let alone a toddler. Too many people, too little space, and no sense of safety. Family members who visited saw the conditions and were horrified. How could Samantha think this was an acceptable place to raise a little girl? But she was blind to the concerns, or unwilling to face them. Eventually, Jared and Samantha moved into their own place in the small town of Trevorton, Pennsylvania. On the surface, it looked like progress, a young couple establishing their independence. But beneath that thin veneer was a darker reality. Jared Burgess wasn't just another poor choice. He was dangerous. In 2018, just a year before meeting Samantha, Jared had been arrested for violence against his pregnant girlfriend. A restraining order had been issued against him, a red flag waving brightly for anyone who cared to look. That order expired only weeks before the tragedy with Arabella unfolded. Yet Samantha, financially dependent on Jared and desperate for stability, ignored the warnings. Once again, Arabella's safety was sacrificed for her mother's need to cling to a relationship. The Parker family saw the danger clearly. Bonnie, Arabella's grandmother, had been watching her daughter make one destructive decision after another. Amanda, now 20 years old, refused to stay quiet. They weren't just encouraging Samantha to leave Jared. They were actively trying to remove Arabella from the situation altogether. Custody petitions, reports to social workers, repeated pleas for intervention. Every step they took seemed to meet resistance. At a 4th of July gathering in 2019, Bonnie noticed marks on both Samantha and Arabella. They weren't the scrapes of play or the clumsy bumps of toddlerhood. They were suspicious, alarming, and clear to anyone with a discerning eye. When Bonnie pressed Samantha, her daughter brushed her off with a dismissive, "Everything's fine. Don't worry about it." But everything was not fine. The family's instincts told them the danger was escalating, even as the system continued to downplay their concerns. The emotional toll on Amanda was heavy. She was only 20, barely out of her teenage years, yet she found herself trying to fill the role of protector and advocate. She had already been ignored once when Arabella lived with Harry Young. Now she watched her little sister fall into another unsafe situation, this time with a young man whose temper and history made him a ticking time bomb. Amanda fought harder, making more calls, trying again to get Child Protective Services to act. But time after time, she was met with indifference. The family began to feel they were shouting into the void. Every warning they raised, every concern they documented, went unanswered. They weren't just battling Jared and Samantha's poor decisions. They were fighting a system that seemed determined to minimize the danger. This was the second major crossroads in Arabella's story. Once again, intervention could have changed everything. Once again, the people who loved her most were sounding the alarm, waving the red flags high, and begging for someone in authority to listen. And once again, those pleas were silenced, ignored, or filed away as minor concerns. The signs were there, obvious, glaring signs. A toddler living in unsafe homes, surrounded by unstable adults, under the care of a mother who made choices that consistently put her at risk. And yet, despite everything, Arabella remained in harm's way. The system had failed to protect her once with Harry Young. Now, with Jared Burgess in the picture, that failure was repeating itself. By the summer of 2019, the pattern was undeniable. Arabella's well-being was not just overlooked, it was dismissed entirely. Family members felt powerless, watching in horror as the little girl they loved so deeply was left exposed to danger. For them, the question was no longer if tragedy would strike, but when. By September 2019, the Parker family was running out of options. For months, they had pleaded, filed reports, and begged anyone in authority to intervene on Arabella's behalf. None of it had worked. The system had dismissed Amanda's calls. Social workers had taken Samantha's word at face value. Arabella's life continued to hang by a thread, balanced on the decisions of adults who seemed unable or unwilling to put her safety first. It was then that Bonnie, Arabella's grandmother, the one who had given her the nickname Sweet Pea, took her most decisive step. She filed for custody. It was a legal move, a last chance to use the courts to rescue her granddaughter from the danger everyone in the family saw but officials refused to act upon. For Bonnie, it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was hope. But on the morning of the custody hearing, that hope slipped through her fingers in the cruelest way. Bonnie was late, just 27 minutes late. It doesn't sound like much, not in the scale of a lifetime, not when a child's safety is at stake. But in the rigid world of the courts, 27 minutes was enough for the hearing to be canceled outright. No testimony, no arguments, no second chances. That single half hour became a symbol of everything that was wrong with Arabella's case. The family had been trying for years to get someone, anyone, to take their concerns seriously. And now, in the one forum that might have made a difference, time itself betrayed them. 27 minutes meant that Arabella would go back home to the very environment her family feared most. Even from behind prison walls, Carl Parker, Arabella's father, understood the weight of what had been lost. Carl was no saint. He had his own long history of failures, his own mistakes that had contributed to the instability of Arabella's early life. But even in his cell, even with his freedom stripped away, he could see clearly what the courts and child services refused to acknowledge. From prison, Carl wrote letters supporting Mandy, his sister-in-law, in her attempts to gain custody of Arabella. He admitted his own shortcomings as a father, recognizing that he could not provide what Arabella needed. Yet he still begged the system to allow someone else in the family to take her in, to protect her, to give her a chance at life. Those letters should have carried weight. They should have signaled to the authorities that even Arabella's own father believed she was in danger under Samantha's care. Instead, they were read, filed, and forgotten. Another cry for help silenced by bureaucracy. The symbolism of those 27 minutes cannot be overstated. For a child, time is everything. Time is the difference between calling 911 immediately and waiting nearly an hour. Time is the difference between medical intervention and irreversible brain damage. Time is the difference between a grandmother making it to court on schedule and arriving just late enough to have the door slammed shut. Arabella's story is marked by these missed moments, these gaps in time where everything could have changed, should have changed, but didn't. Bonnie left the courthouse that day devastated. She had gone in believing this might be her chance. Her moment to finally wrest her granddaughter away from danger. She walked out knowing she had lost that chance. Not because she wasn't fit, not because the evidence wasn't on her side, but because of 27 minutes. The weight of that failure pressed down on the entire family. They knew they were running out of ways to protect Arabella, and they knew time once again was working against them. For Arabella, the clock was ticking down. Every day spent in that unstable home brought new risks, new dangers, new chances for tragedy. And with every passing hour, the family's ability to intervene slipped further away. This was the tragedy of the missed hearing, not just the technicality of lateness, but the larger truth it revealed. Arabella's life was governed by moments when action was delayed, when responses came too slowly, when warnings were ignored. In the end, it was time itself, stolen, wasted, or dismissed, that became her greatest enemy. October 10th, 2019, began like so many other days in Trevorton, Pennsylvania. But for 3-year-old Arabella Parker, it would be the day that sealed her fate. By then, the family's alarms had been sounding for months. Grandmother Bonnie had tried the courts. Amanda had tried Child Protective Services. Even Carl from inside a prison cell had raised his voice. And yet, Arabella remained in the same home, surrounded by the same dangers. That afternoon, Bonnie decided she had to see her granddaughter. She went to Samantha's home only to find the door slammed in her face. Samantha refused to let her inside. Alarm bells rang in Bonnie's mind. This wasn't just stubbornness, something was wrong. She called authorities, insisting someone needed to check on Arabella immediately. By midday, a social worker and local police arrived at the small house. This was the system's chance, their opportunity to prove they could protect a vulnerable child when family concerns reached a boiling point. The visit should have been thorough, a careful assessment of Arabella's safety. Instead, what unfolded was little more than a box-ticking exercise. The social worker spoke briefly with the adults inside. A glance around the home, a few surface-level questions, and the visit was over. Arabella herself was never examined. Not a single piece of clothing was lifted to check for bruises. Not a single medical evaluation was requested. Later reports revealed that if they had taken just a few extra minutes, if someone had insisted on actually laying eyes on Arabella, looking closely at her body, they would have seen the truth. They would have seen the marks, the bruises, the red flags. But they didn't. The officials left satisfied, noting, "No concerns." That missed opportunity was fatal. Hours later, the consequences of that negligence would unfold in horrifying detail. That evening, Samantha was in the kitchen washing dishes. Arabella sat at the dining table, her plate in front of her, picking at food like any child her age might do. She wasn't eating quickly enough for Jared Burgess, the 18-year-old who had already shown his temper in the past. What should have been nothing more than a normal mealtime squabble spiraled into violence. From the kitchen, Samantha heard Jared's voice rising. She turned and rushed in to see him holding Arabella against the wall in a way that made her heart stop. She screamed, tried to intervene, but Jared shoved her down so hard her glasses flew off her face. Disoriented, scrambling to see, she looked up just in time to watch Jared propel her 3-year-old daughter across the room. Arabella's small body flew 2 to 3 feet before crashing down. The bottom half of her body landed awkwardly on a Minnie Mouse couch made for children, but her head struck the floor with devastating force. The impact caused immediate trauma. Within moments, Arabella began seizing, her tiny body overwhelmed by the sudden storm inside her brain. This was the critical moment, the fork in the road where everything depended on what Jared and Samantha chose to do next. An innocent child was in medical crisis. Every second mattered. But instead of calling 911 immediately, Jared reached for his phone and dialed his mother, Christy Lynn Willis, a nurse's aide. What followed is chilling because we no longer have to guess what happened. Digital records, phone logs, and search histories reveal the timeline with microscopic precision. At 8:59 p.m., someone in the house typed into Google, "What to do when toddlers have seizures." That single search is haunting because it confirms what investigators later emphasized. Arabella's condition was obvious, and the adults knew she was in crisis. Between 9 a.m. and 9:45 p.m., 4 calls were exchanged between Jared and his mother, Christy. Those 45 minutes weren't spent trying to save Arabella's life. They were spent trying to save themselves. Christy eventually arrived at the house, not with urgency to call paramedics, but with instructions to cover up the truth. Together, they crafted a story they thought might protect them. Arabella had suffered a sudden seizure out of nowhere. No violence, no accident, just an unexplained medical episode. It wasn't until 9:48 p.m., 49 minutes after Arabella first struck the floor, that 911 was finally called. 49 minutes. Nearly an hour in which a child's brain was swelling, her body fighting for life, while the adults around her chose lies over honesty, fear over responsibility. That delay sealed Arabella's fate. In pediatric emergencies, especially head trauma, time is everything. Doctors later confirmed that if Arabella had been brought in immediately, her chances of survival would have been far higher. Instead, she was delivered to the hospital nearly an hour later, her condition deteriorating with every passing minute. When paramedics arrived, they were met with the fabricated story. Arabella had been eating dinner when she suddenly began seizing. No mention of Jared throwing her, no mention of the impact with the floor. The lie was repeated at the hospital, where Samantha, Jared, and Christy all insisted there was no cause they could identify. The deception left doctors working blind. Pediatric seizures can stem from many conditions: fever, infection, even genetic disorders. Believing the story they were told, the emergency team followed protocol for unexplained seizures. They ran blood work, ordered tests, checked for infections. Meanwhile, Arabella's brain continued to swell. Every tick of the clock pushed her further from the possibility of recovery. It wasn't until the medical team reached the CT scan that the truth was revealed in all its horror. The images showed massive trauma, hemorrhaging, swelling, and injuries no spontaneous seizure could explain. This was not a mystery illness. This was blunt force trauma. This was violence. And the CT scan wasn't the only evidence. Arabella's body bore the signs of a pattern, not a single incident. Doctors cataloged more than 44 separate injuries: rib fractures in various stages of healing, broken clavicles, internal bleeding, pulmonary contusions, hemorrhaging in sensitive areas no child should ever have. These weren't the marks of a one-time accident. They were the history of a little girl living in danger for months, maybe longer. Neurosurgeons were called immediately. They worked for hours, removing part of Arabella's skull to relieve pressure, carefully extracting damaged tissue in a desperate attempt to save her. The surgery was as successful as it could be under the circumstances. But when it was over, the prognosis was grim. Doctors estimated Arabella had only a 10% chance of survival, and even if she beat those odds, she would likely face lifelong complications. Back at the house, investigators were already piecing together the digital trail, the 859 Google search, the phone records showing multiple calls to Christy. The fact that Christy herself had come to the home before paramedics were ever called. Together, they painted a damning picture of adults who had prioritized self-preservation over the life of a child. Christy's role was especially damning. As a nurse's aide, she should have known the urgency of the situation. Yet instead of urging her son to call 911 immediately, she became part of the cover-up. She coached him on what to say, and when paramedics finally arrived, she inserted herself into the timeline, falsely claiming she had been present all along. This collusion wasn't just morally indefensible, it was criminal. By delaying the call for help, by lying to emergency responders, Jared and Christy robbed Arabella of her best chance at survival. Later, investigators would describe that 49-minute window as the most critical part of the case. Because in those minutes, choices were made. Choices that valued lies over life, excuses over accountability, and cowardice over courage. Choices that revealed not only Jared's violence, but also Christy's willingness to protect her son at all costs, even at the cost of a child's life. That evening encapsulated everything that had gone wrong in Arabella's story. The system had already failed her earlier that very day when a welfare check amounted to little more than a glance through a doorway. And when tragedy struck hours later, the adults closest to her failed her again, choosing delay and deception over honesty and urgency. 49 minutes. It's a small sliver of time in the span of a life, but for Arabella, it was everything. In those 49 minutes, her future was stolen, her chances destroyed, and the truth buried under a web of lies. And yet, as devastating as the night was, the story was only beginning to unfold. Because what happened after Arabella was rushed to the hospital would take the case from a private tragedy into a national conversation. A courtroom drama, a television confrontation, and a shocking twist years later would make Arabella's name a haunting reminder of what happens when systems fail and families are ignored. When the ambulance doors swung open at Geisinger Medical Center that night, Arabella's small body was already battered and failing. Paramedics wheeled her inside, repeating the story they had been told by Jared, Samantha, and Christy, that the 3-year-old had suddenly begun seizing at the dinner table, with no warning and no apparent cause. The emergency team sprang into action, but their starting point was wrong. They believed they were dealing with an unexplained neurological event, not blunt force trauma. That distinction mattered. It dictated every decision, every test, every minute spent following the wrong trail while Arabella's brain swelled against the confines of her skull. Initial protocols for seizures in children are systematic. Blood samples are drawn, looking for infections, electrolyte imbalances, or signs of fever. Doctors check for meningitis, for epilepsy, for anything that might explain a sudden collapse. While those steps unfolded, Arabella's brain continued to deteriorate. With each passing moment, pressure built inside her head, robbing neurons of oxygen and shutting down the delicate circuitry that powered her young life. When she was finally taken for a CT scan, the truth appeared in black and white. The images on the screen silenced the room. This was not the brain of a child who had simply seized. This was the brain of a child who had been violently injured. Hemorrhages bloomed across both hemispheres, clots pressed into tissue, and swelling had already reached catastrophic levels. The radiologist's report used phrases no parent ever wants to hear: acute cerebral hemorrhage, bilateral subdural hematomas, extensive cerebral edema, and those were just the head injuries. A closer physical exam, belatedly performed after the scan shattered the seizure story, revealed still more. Doctors counted more than 44 separate injuries across Arabella's body. Multiple rib fractures in various stages of healing, broken clavicles, contusions across her lungs, abdominal bleeding, bruises where no child should ever bear them. Each mark told a story not of a single bad night, but of sustained harm over weeks or months. The team knew they were facing a fight against time. Neurosurgeons were called in, rushing to the operating room where Arabella was prepped for emergency surgery. The goal was simple: relieve the pressure building inside her skull before it destroyed what remained of her brain function. Under bright surgical lights, part of Arabella's skull was carefully removed, creating space for swelling that would otherwise crush her brainstem. Damaged tissue was excised, blood evacuated, and drains placed to prevent further accumulation. The surgeons worked for hours, their hands steady, but their hearts heavy. They knew even the best outcome might not be enough. When the operation was finally over, the chief neurosurgeon walked out to deliver the news that no family is ever ready to hear. Arabella had survived the procedure, but her chances were slim. 10%, maybe less. And even if she beat those odds, the likelihood of lasting disabilities was high. Loss of mobility, impaired speech, permanent seizures, or worse. By then, word of what had happened was spreading through the family. Bonnie, Mimi to her sweet pea, arrived at the hospital with a mix of panic and dread. Amanda soon followed, carrying the unbearable weight of knowing she had tried to save Arabella for months, but had been ignored at every turn. They joined Mandy, the aunt who would soon be granted emergency custody, in keeping vigil by the bedside. In the pediatric intensive care unit, Arabella was connected to a web of machines. A ventilator breathed for her. Monitors tracked every heartbeat, every flicker of brain activity. IV lines delivered medications meant to control swelling and stave off infection. Around her, the relentless chorus of beeping machines marked time with merciless precision. The staff did everything possible. But they were battling against biology, against time, and against the lies that had delayed their care. One physician later admitted that if Arabella had been brought in immediately after the injury, the prognosis might have been different. Instead, those 49 minutes of delay had stolen her chance before she ever reached the operating table. As days turned into nights, the family sat by her side. Bonnie stroked Arabella's fiery red hair, whispering the nickname that had once been said with laughter, but was now spoken through tears. Sweet Pea. Amanda sang the hymns her sister had loved. Jesus loves me. Jesus loves the little children, hoping some fragment of the songs might reach her unconscious mind. Mandy prayed aloud, pleading with God to give the little girl one more chance. The contrast between the hospital's unrelenting machines and Arabella's fragile body was unbearable. Here was a child who had once danced to music, turned shopping carts into carriages, and handed out hugs like candy. Now she lay still, fighting a battle her tiny body had not chosen. Behind the scenes, law enforcement was already piecing together what the doctors had uncovered. The CT scans, the pattern of injuries, the timeline of phone calls and internet searches, it all contradicted the story Jared, Samantha, and Christy had told. The medical findings didn't just reveal trauma, they revealed lies. Lies that had cost a little girl her best chance at survival. For the doctors and nurses who cared for Arabella, the experience left scars of their own. They had seen many tragedies, but few so preventable. They had been misled, forced to start from the wrong assumption, and by the time the truth came to light, it was almost too late. Their frustration was palpable. Medicine can work miracles, but only when it is paired with honesty and urgency. In Arabella's case, she was given neither. Every hour Arabella remained alive in that hospital was a testament to her willpower. But the prognosis loomed over everyone like a shadow. 10%. 10 fragile points of hope clinging to a little girl's chance at survival. And while her family prayed, while the medical team monitored every flicker on the screens, her mother was about to make a choice that stunned everyone who watched the case unfold. Because instead of staying by her daughter's side, Samantha Delcamp walked into a television studio to plead her case to the world. While Arabella lay unconscious in a hospital bed, her head bandaged from emergency surgery and machines keeping her alive, her mother was preparing to step into the spotlight of national television. Samantha Delcamp had agreed to appear on the Steve Wilkos Show, a talk show notorious for exposing lies, confronting abusers, and delivering raw, unfiltered drama. To some, the decision was baffling. Why would a young mother, whose child hovered between life and death, choose to sit on a stage in front of cameras instead of staying by her daughter's bedside? To others, the choice revealed something more disturbing. Samantha was desperate not for Arabella's healing, but for her own redemption in the eyes of the public. When Samantha walked onto the Wilkos stage, she framed herself as a victim. She painted Jared as the abuser, the one who controlled her life through violence and fear. She described herself as powerless, insisting she lived in terror of what he might do next. The audience listened, uneasy but sympathetic. A young woman trapped in a cycle of domestic abuse is a tragic story, one many had seen before. The highlight of her appearance came with the polygraph test. On live television, Samantha submitted to questions about whether she had directly harmed Arabella or played a role in causing her injuries. When the results came back, the machine suggested she was telling the truth. She had not personally inflicted the damage. For a moment, it seemed like Samantha's gamble had paid off. The audience gasped in relief. She was cleared, at least in the limited terms of the show's format. But polygraphs are not admissible in court for a reason. They measure stress, not truth. A practiced liar or someone deeply invested in their narrative can pass. Still, for the millions of viewers watching at home, those blinking results could have been enough to sway opinion. Samantha might have walked away as the mother wronged by circumstance, the young woman crushed by a violent partner. Then Steve Wilkos leaned forward. In his gruff, no-nonsense voice, he cut through the applause and the shallow victory of the test. "I don't need a machine to tell me the truth," he said. "I don't need a test to tell me you failed your daughter. When it came to your own child fighting for her life, you were a coward." The words landed with the weight of a gavel. The studio audience went silent. The country went silent. In that moment, the polygraph results no longer mattered. What mattered was the image of a mother who had abandoned her child. In the most living rooms, across social media, public opinion shifted. Samantha became a lightning rod for outrage. Strangers who had never met Arabella grieved for her, while condemning her mother for what they now viewed as cowardice. Mothers, especially, spoke with fury. "You protect your child no matter what," many wrote. "You don't wait, you don't excuse, you don't leave her in danger." Wilkos' blunt declaration did something the system had failed to do. It forced the world to confront the idea that motherhood is not always synonymous with protection, that the instinct to fight for your child can be smothered by fear, by selfishness, or by the desperate desire to hold on to a relationship at all costs. For investigators, the show became a turning point as well. Until then, Samantha had been treated largely as another victim of Jared's violence, someone trapped in circumstances beyond her control. But the inconsistencies in her story, combined with her public attempt to clear her name, painted a more complicated picture. Law enforcement began to scrutinize her role more closely, not just as a passive bystander, but as someone who might have chosen self-preservation over her daughter's life. The show also revealed something else: the power of perception. While medical records, digital evidence, and sworn testimony build cases in courtrooms, public opinion is shaped by emotion. Seeing Samantha sit on a stage, defending herself, only to be called out so harshly, crystallized what many already suspected. She wasn't a mother desperate to save her daughter. She was a young woman desperate to save face. In the days that followed, clips from the episode spread online. The moment Wilkos told Samantha she had failed, her daughter was replayed again and again, becoming a viral symbol of accountability. For many, it was more compelling than any court transcript could ever be. Here was a mother, confronted on national television, stripped of excuses, and judged in real time. Meanwhile, back at Geisinger Medical Center, Arabella remained on life support. Her family, Bonnie, Amanda, Mandy, stayed close, praying, singing, hoping against hope for a miracle. They had no patience for talk shows or cameras. Their focus was on Sweet Pea, the little girl who still clung to life despite everything. The contrast between the family's vigil at the hospital and Samantha's televised performance only deepened the public's outrage. The Wilkos episode marked the moment when Arabella's case stopped being just another tragic story buried in local news. It became national. It became personal. People who had never heard her name before now spoke of her with sorrow and anger. And in that fury, pressure began to build, not just on Jared, but on Samantha, and even on the systems that had failed her so completely. The media had reframed the narrative. Arabella wasn't just another statistic. She was a symbol of what happens when silence, cowardice, and bureaucracy combine to destroy a child's life. And as public opinion turned, investigators began to move with greater urgency. Samantha's attempt to prove her innocence had backfired spectacularly. What was supposed to be her absolution became the moment when the world and the authorities began to see her not as a victim, but as someone who had failed her daughter in ways no polygraph could ever measure. In the days that followed, clips from the episode spread online. The moment Wilkos told Samantha she had failed, her daughter was replayed again and again, becoming a viral symbol of accountability. For many, it was more compelling than any court transcript could ever be. Here was a mother, confronted on national television, stripped of excuses, and judged in real time. Meanwhile, back at Geisinger Medical Center, Arabella remained on life support. Her family, Bonnie, Amanda, Mandy, stayed close, praying, singing, hoping against hope for a miracle. They had no patience for talk shows or cameras. Their focus was on Sweet Pea, the little girl who still clung to life despite everything. The contrast between the family's vigil at the hospital and Samantha's televised performance only deepened the public's outrage. The Wilkos episode marked the moment when Arabella's case stopped being just another tragic story buried in local news. It became national. It became personal. People who had never heard her name before now spoke of her with sorrow and anger. And in that fury, pressure began to build, not just on Jared, but on Samantha, and even on the systems that had failed her so completely. The media had reframed the narrative. Arabella wasn't just another statistic. She was a symbol of what happens when silence, cowardice, and bureaucracy combine to destroy a child's life. And as public opinion turned, investigators began to move with greater urgency. Samantha's attempt to prove her innocence had backfired spectacularly. What was supposed to be her absolution became the moment when the world and the authorities began to see her not as a victim, but as someone who had failed her daughter in ways no polygraph could ever measure. As Arabella's story spread beyond the walls of her hospital room and into homes across the nation, investigators worked to piece together the chain of events that had led her there. Doctors had done their part. They had exposed the lie of sudden seizures and revealed the truth written across CT scans and a body covered with injuries. Now it was up to law enforcement to determine who bore responsibility and how far the cover-up had gone. The digital trail proved devastating. Jared Burgess's phone logs told one story, his mother Christy's phone logs told another, and the timestamps made it impossible to deny. At 8:59 p.m., the Google search, "What to do when toddlers have seizures," showed consciousness of the crisis. 4 separate phone calls between Jared and Christy over the next 49 minutes showed coordination, not panic. Finally, at 9:48 p.m., the 911 call went out, far too late to offer Arabella her best chance at survival. Investigators also found Christy's own phone records supported her active involvement. She hadn't been a bystander. She had driven to the house, conspired with her son, and helped craft the false story given to paramedics. The lie wasn't improvisation. It was a strategy. And every minute spent protecting Jared was another minute Arabella lay untreated, her brain swelling beyond repair. Jared was arrested first. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Arabella's injuries were consistent with violent handling, and in a recorded interview, he eventually admitted to pressing her against the wall and throwing her across the room. He tried to downplay it, calling it an accident, a mistake in the heat of the moment. But the medical findings told another story: broken ribs in different stages of healing, old bruises, a fractured clavicle. This was not the first time Arabella had been hurt. Jared's violence wasn't a one-time lapse. It was a pattern. At first, Samantha was treated as another victim. She had told the story of living under Jared's control, had cried on national television about being afraid of him. But investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. Why hadn't she called for help earlier? Why had she continued to live with Jared despite his history of violence? Why had she told doctors the seizure story even when she knew it wasn't true? Slowly, Samantha's role shifted from bystander to accomplice. She hadn't thrown Arabella, but by choosing silence, she had failed her daughter. Christy Willis, Jared's mother, was arrested for obstruction and false statements. To investigators, her actions were nearly as damning as Jared's. As a nurse's aide, she knew better. She had the medical knowledge to understand how urgent the situation was, and instead of urging her son to call 911 immediately, she helped him build a lie. Her instinct had been to protect her son's freedom, not Arabella's life. The case moved through the courts with grim efficiency. Prosecutors had the medical records, the digital evidence, and the confessions. They also had public pressure, fueled by media coverage and outrage. This wasn't just a local case anymore. It was a test of whether the justice system would finally deliver accountability in a story riddled with systemic failures. In court, the testimonies were chilling. Doctors described the extent of Arabella's injuries, cataloging each fracture, each bruise, each sign of ongoing harm. Detectives walked jurors through the phone logs, showing how 49 minutes of hesitation became 49 minutes of betrayal. And when Jared's own words were played back, his admission of the throw, his attempt to minimize it as an accident, the jurors heard what Arabella herself could no longer say. The verdicts were swift. Jared Burgess was convicted of third-degree homicide, child endangerment, and related charges. The judge sentenced him to 24 to 50 years in prison, the maximum allowed by law. He would be middle-aged, if not elderly, by the time he had any chance of freedom. For many who had followed the case, it was a measure of justice. though no sentence could undo the damage done to Arabella's short life. Samantha Delcamp was convicted of involuntary manslaughter as an accomplice, along with charges of child endangerment. The court recognized that while she hadn't delivered the fatal blow, her repeated choices, living with Jared, ignoring red flags, and lying to doctors, had contributed to Arabella's death. She was sentenced to 12 to 25 years. For some, it was a harsh outcome for a young mother. For others, it was not nearly enough. What united opinion was the belief that she had failed in the most fundamental responsibility of motherhood, to protect her child at all costs. Christy Willis received 17 months to 17 years for obstruction of justice and false statements. Her sentence reflected her role as a co-conspirator in the cover-up, someone who might have saved Arabella with a single phone call, but chose deception instead. Though her punishment was lighter, the moral weight of her actions lingered heavily. When the sentences were read, the courtroom was filled with mixed emotions: grief, relief, exhaustion. Bonnie sat quietly, clutching a photo of Sweet Pea. Amanda wept openly, her body shaking with the release of years of frustration and helplessness. Mandy held her husband's hand, knowing they had done all they could, but still carrying the ache of what had been lost. The legal system had finally delivered accountability, but it came too late. Arabella was gone. The family walked out of the courthouse with convictions in hand, but no child to bring home. The sentences were measured in years. Arabella's life had been measured in only 3. For the public, the outcome was bittersweet. Justice had been served, at least within the limits of the law. Jared would pay for his violence, Samantha for her complicity, Christy for her lies. Yet the underlying failures remained. The ignored reports, the missed custody hearing, the welfare check that amounted to nothing, the 49 minutes that stretched into eternity. In the end, the trials were about more than punishment. They were about acknowledgement. They forced the system to say out loud what the family had known all along, that Arabella Parker's death was not an accident. It was the product of violence, neglect, lies, and a chain of failures that allowed a little girl's life to be stolen. For a time, it seemed the story of Arabella Parker had reached its conclusion. The perpetrators were behind bars, the courtroom battles finished, and the family left to mourn in private. But in January 2023, nearly 4 years after Arabella's death, a shocking headline brought the Parker name back into the news. Amanda Parker, the same half-sister who had fought so desperately to save Arabella, who had testified against Samantha, who had become a public voice for justice, was arrested. The charges were chillingly familiar. Amanda's 6-month-old daughter had suffered a serious head injury. There were delays in seeking treatment, text messages discussing false explanations for doctors, and eerie echoes of Arabella's case. The baby was airlifted to Geisinger Medical Center in Danville, the very hospital where Arabella had died. Unlike Arabella, Amanda's daughter survived, though she remained in critical condition. The public's reaction was disbelief. How could someone who had lived through Arabella's tragedy repeat such patterns? Some saw Amanda as another cautionary tale about cycles of trauma, how violence and neglect can ripple through families for generations. Others saw it as hypocrisy, proof that even those who speak loudest about injustice can falter when responsibility is their own. Yet Arabella's legacy endured, even through this bitter twist. In the weeks after her death, vigils had been held across Pennsylvania. Strangers gathered with candles, holding photos of a little red-haired girl nicknamed Sweet Pea. They prayed, cried, and promised that her name would not be forgotten. For many, Arabella symbolized every child failed by the very systems designed to protect them. Her case ignited calls for reform. Advocates demanded that Child Protective Services conduct mandatory physical exams during welfare checks, that delays in reporting injuries be treated with the utmost seriousness, and that custody disputes be given higher urgency when concerns about safety are raised. Lawmakers debated new escalation protocols to ensure that warnings from relatives, teachers, and doctors could no longer be dismissed with a note of no concerns. Those reforms were not just about Arabella. They were about every child still waiting for adults to do the right thing. Every time her story is told, it reinforces the truth that protecting children must never be left to chance or to bureaucracy or to the flawed judgment of those who think they know better. Arabella would have turned 9 years old this year. She might have been starting 3rd grade, chasing fireflies in the summer, and making up new stories with her pink polka dot blanket. Instead, she lives on in the memory of those who gathered at vigils, in the reforms her tragedy inspired, and in the quiet vow of every parent and advocate who says, "Never again." Friends, if Arabella's story moved you, please share this video so her memory continues to shine. And let me ask you, do you believe the system can truly change, or will more children like Arabella slip through the cracks?